Wisconsin Eye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
Wisconsin Eye coverage of the 2014 elections continue with an interview with Pete Flesch of Soldiers Grove. He's a Democrat running in the 96th Assembly District. Mr. Flesch, welcome to Wisconsin Eye.
Thank you for the invitation.
And a programming note, Wisconsin Eye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. This is your first run for Capitol office.
It is. I've been a local official.
Yeah, give us a short version of your background. Excuse me for interrupting you.
It's no problem. I've been a local official for 15 years. I served on my local town board and as town board chairman, and I've been on the Crawford County Board for 12 years. And I'm currently in my third term as county board chairman. I own a 250-acre dairy and beef farm in rural Soldiers Grove. I just sold my dairy herd in March, so I don't milk cows anymore. My arthritic knees convinced me that I should maybe retire from dairying while I could still walk. It takes its toll, but I've purchased my farm from my grandparents when I was 20 years old. It's the only place I've ever lived. When I was growing up, my grandpa worked for the local township. He was on the road crew. He was the guy who plowed the snow, the guy that fixed the culverts and graded the roads. Back in those days, almost all the town roads were gravel, so he was out there with the road grader, smoothing them all out for people. And he's the one that taught me that being a public employee and being a public service were honorable things to do. So when I felt that it was my turn, when I could have something to give back to my community, I ran for the town board on the town where my grandpa used to work, and I felt like it was something I enjoyed. I like local government. It's a good way to give back to the community. I feel like everyone should give back to the community in some way. This was a way that felt good to me, and I've always enjoyed local government.
Was there any? We've had a very interesting 4 years in the Capitol. Was there any major policy issue or policy decision that caused you to run this year, Pete?
There were several. Of course, Act 10 was a very divisive thing.
You don't sound like you would have voted for it, right?
No, I would not have voted for it.
Why?
Several reasons. For one thing, there were a number of unintended consequences that came with Act 10. One thing, we lost several grant opportunities from the federal government because our employees were no longer had collective bargaining rights. We lost several good employees because of the divisiveness of the law. They just felt like, they told me that just didn't feel like a good time to be a public employee. They felt like they weren't appreciated, and that a lot of the public was hostile towards them, and that's unfortunate because we got a lot of really good employees. The same with our local school districts. We had a lot of good teachers. We lost some of them retired. So overall, I think it was a negative thing.
Well, you mentioned school districts. Let's talk about if you're in the assembly, you're going to play a role in the discussion over how to fund public schools and how much state money to give to public schools. What are your thoughts on what amount of state resources should go to K-12 in the next budget cycle?
Right. My district has a lot of very small school districts, small with declining enrollments. We've got places like Kickapoo, Lafarge, DeSoto, Seneca school districts. These are districts that the current funding formula doesn't really work for. The current funding formula, to be really simple, it considers population and property values.
Property wealth.
I think a good place to start a conversation would be with Secretary Evers' Fair Funding for Our Future initiative. I think there are things in there that would help our local districts. Things like taking into account the residents' ability to pay, not just the value of their property. So I think that would be a great place to start a conversation. We have to have a serious conversation because the small rural districts that I would represent, that are in the county that I represent, and the other counties in the district, are hurting. I'm a very proud graduate of North Crawford High School, class of a while back.
Whatever.
Class of whatever. And I think I got a good education. It served me well. And I think the people, the teachers, the administrators in our district are capable of giving our students a good education if they're given the resources. We need to find a way to get the resources they need, because the students in rural Wisconsin deserve to have as good an education as in the urban and suburban areas.
Part of that discussion is going to be in the next budget, the choice or voucher program. How do you feel about those, sir?
I would vote to repeal statewide budgets, the statewide voucher
Statewide vouchers,
program.
even in the two large cities that started them, Racine and Milwaukee?
I would be open to those two remaining restricted to those two places if the educators in those districts think it's worthwhile. The data that I have seen doesn't really show that those students in voucher schools perform any better than the public schools any of the data that I've seen. As far as expanding it throughout the state, I believe all that does is take resources away from our local public schools. Students in my district aren't benefiting from the millions of dollars that's going to voucher schools in places like Green Bay, Appleton, or Racine. So I would vote to repeal statewide vouchers.
And the governor recently called for the withdrawal or the repeal of Common Core standards. Your position on that?
That's been an interesting issue that's come up. A lot of the folks that are calling for the repeal of Common Core now were for it before they were against it. That's just political gamesmanship. I don't think there's anything wrong with the Common Core standards. These are standards that school districts should aim to meet. They don't put down specific teaching requirements. Our school districts have already spent many hours and millions of dollars preparing for this. It's really sad in my mind that this will be used basically as a political football, just for political purposes. I think it's just a sad commentary.
Okay. Now, you and other farmers in the 96th district need good roads to get your products out, your commodities out.
Yes, we do.
Yet there's the Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance says there's a transportation funding potential deficit of, if you spend at the 2013 rate for 10 years, the deficit could be $2 billion. If you think there's a deficit, how do you think it should be fixed?
Well, one thing we can't do is what we've done in the last two budget cycles, which is borrow to fix it. We've borrowed $1 billion the last two budget cycles just to close the gap to maintain the roads we've got. We can't sustain that. Right now, 20% of the transportation budget goes to just pay off our debts. We can't keep doing that. We have to have a really serious discussion about how we want our infrastructure to be and how we want to fund it. I think the Secretary of Transportation made a good start this year when he had held listening sessions around the state and brought up the subject to get people's views. We need to come together in the state legislature, and we got some hard decisions to make.
Would you consider raising the gas tax or the $75 per year vehicle registration fee?
Those are really the only two tools we've got to generate more income. I know there are some other things that have been kind of bandied about. There's been talk of toll roads, which I think should be on the table and should be part of this discussion, but that's not something that's going to solve our problem in the next budget cycle. That's going to be something down the road. So yes, I would be open to that. The gas tax hasn't been increased since 2006. that's we really need to have a discussion about, do we want to maintain the infrastructure we have? Do we want to let it deteriorate? Do we want to improve it? I mean, that's critical for our economy. We have a really serious problem to solve, and there's not one thing that's going to solve it. It's going to be a combination of things, and we have to discuss how we're going to do this.
Question on health care. 1 in 5 Wisconsin residents get their health care from the Medicaid system. The American Hospital Association says our Medicaid reimbursement rates are the second lowest in the nation. If you've studied the issue, do you have a position on whether those rates should be increased, sir?
They need to be increased. It's hurting hospitals in rural areas that serve rural areas like my district. It's a real issue with the amount of patients that the hospitals in poor rural areas serve. So yes, I do believe they need to be increased. I'm not sure how much they need to be increased, but they do need to be increased. That's a discussion we need to have.
Okay. There has been a bill introduced. There'll be another one to legalize medical marijuana. Traveling with that, of course, is the Colorado and Washington experiences on recreational marijuana. What are your feelings on that issue?
I don't believe anyone should go to jail for smoking pot. It's legalized in a couple of states. Medical marijuana, there is data on that to show that it is useful for some patients. Very, very legitimate data. So I would support the medical marijuana. For the last 30 years, we've been having a war on drugs, and I'm not really sure it's been successful. I don't know that it's done anything except fill up our prisons. I believe that we could have a lot more success if we shifted towards looking at drugs as more of a public health issue instead of a law enforcement issue. I just look at the example of cigarette smoking. We've made an effort in the last 30 years to cut down on the number of people that smoke cigarettes, and this is a substance that's highly addictive, that was socially acceptable just a couple of generations ago, and we've made great stride in cutting the number of smokers, and we've done it without putting anybody in jail. I think that's a good example to follow.
On a environmental question, I assume frac sand mining is an issue in the 96th, is it? It
is.
Well, what's the balance? Do local governments have enough to make sure that any frac sand mines don't damage the environment and their highways, or should there be some state standards set, sir?
Well, I think the state would be good to have the state enable and assist local governments on this. The argument that the industry is being strangled by local regulation just doesn't seem to hold up when you consider the fact that we've gone from less than 10 industrial sand mines to over 300. That doesn't seem like an industry that's being strangled to me. What our experience in Crawford County is, we put in a 6-month frac sand moratorium in place. We brought together town and village officials. We studied the situation. At the county level, we helped towns and villages to draft a licensing ordinance for frac sand mines. And then we turned it over to them with the option to modify it and adopt it if they seen fit. Most of the towns and villages in Crawford County adopted some form of this licensing ordinance to give them some authority to give some leverage over the sand mining companies. And I can tell you, if you want to see real grassroots democracy in action, you should go to see some of the plan commission meetings in a municipality of under 400, 500, 600 people. That's what it's really all about. I don't see how anybody could be against that.
I see. That's fascinating. That's a slice of local democracy in action, huh?
Absolutely. That's why I love local government.
Okay. It was an issue in the Democratic race for Attorney General in the primary. Should first offense drunken driving be a crime?
I don't believe it should be. I mean, make no mistake. Alcohol abuse, drunk driving is a very serious offense. It's a serious problem in our state. I'm not sure making first offense a crime is the answer. I think making treatment available, giving people the opportunity to correct their behavior and not make another mistake might be a better approach. Again, putting more people in jail, I don't think is a good answer. I think helping people modify their behavior. An OWI is still a very serious deal. There's the large fines. The consequences to people's insurance coverage is very severe. I'm not convinced that making the first offense criminal is the answer.
Okay, then my final question, do you want to highlight any differences between you and the incumbent, Mr. Nearison, that you're running against on November 4th?
Well, Mr. Nearison and I have similar backgrounds, but we have different values. He voted to reject the federal Medicaid expansion. I'll vote to accept it. He voted to expand the voucher program statewide. I will vote to cut that back. I will support legislation to make the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation successful and accountable. I'll support legislation to make people's ability to vote more convenient instead of less convenient. I'll support legislation to make sure every woman has the opportunity to make her own health care decisions. Those are some of the really stark differences between my opponent and I. I think my positions on these issues are ones that better reflect those of the people of my district.
Very good. Thank you. Pete Flesch of Soldier Grove is the Democratic candidate in the 96th Assembly District. Pete, thanks for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.